Welcome to The Human Edge. This week's guest is Madeleine Holt. Madeleine had a 20-year career as a BBC journalist before going into education awareness and campaigning. This conversation was like a journey through the UK education landscape, everything that is right and wrong about it, and what we can do to make a much better, more equitable education system for future generations. I found it really fascinating. I hope you do too. If you do, please like, share, subscribe, all of that good stuff. It'll be massively helpful. Thank you. So you said to me this morning, as I was getting ready to leave the house, that you're having your 15 minutes of fame, or certainly with your kids, where your kids are concerned. An interview that you did many years ago for the Culture Show, is that right?
Yeah, that's
with
right,
Tom York of Radiohead.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that.
So, my kids are all, they're beyond teenage, two of them now. One of them's still a teenager. They said, "Mum, you're famous." And they sent me this still of a picture of me from TikTok, I think it was, which I don't do yet. Yeah. I'm limbering up to it.
Okay.
And it was a shot of me in an interview with Tom York. I think there was actually a little clip of the interview where I asked him what song he would sort of take to his grave, as it were. And it was about 19 years ago. And it was funny to see it, actually, because it was a reminder of, I spent 21 years at the BBC before moving into what I do now.
And I want to talk about both. So let's begin at the end of the BBC phase, and your transition from journalism into what you do now, which in my mind is kind of campaigning, activism around education. I don't know if I've described that correctly, but that's how
filmmaking, which is
and
part
the
of
filmmaking.
it.
That's right. So what motivated you to make that career pivot?
Well, I got made redundant.
Okay.
Well, basically, they wound up my job. I was the first culture correspondent on Newsnight. I went to a high up years ago, in 1999, and said, there's a real role for investigations and hard-hitting journalism within the world of culture. And finally it happened, and I did that for 10 years, but I kind of always felt it was quite a vulnerable post because, for all the reasons we know about, culture is not ever really seen as that important. Yeah. So there were constant cuts in the time I was at the BBC. I started in 1989. I can't ever remember a time when there weren't cuts. So there was another round of cuts at Newsnight, and they got rid of some of the specialists. I mean, the business correspondent, science correspondent, and I was another of the roles that they decided to get rid of. So I took voluntary redundancy, which I was actually really happy about because I'd been a reporter since 1989 was when I joined the BBC Radio Cornwall, because I grew up in the West Country, and I wanted to do something different. And the transition came about quite naturally because I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but I remember thinking, follow my instincts, and I'll end up where I really feel I can make a contribution. And I've always been very, very interested in state education and making it work for everybody, whatever their background, whatever their story. And so I ended up thinking up this thing called Meet the Parents, which basically kind of is a very journalistic idea. It's basically about filling an information gap between school open days, which are obviously now very schmoozy, Bunsen burners all over the show, science dissection here and there and everywhere. Yeah. And then all the kind of rumours and gossip and stuff that you hear that's often stuck to schools for years and years that you hear in the playground, the kind of chit-chat between parents. And I'd seen some research saying that chit-chat was the most significant thing when it came to people deciding where to send their kids for secondary. And so I thought there's a role here for bringing in families that are at the local comprehensives and getting them to talk openly about their experience to worried primary school parents in the feeder primary schools. And that's how Meet the Parents came about. And that was, I think I started it in 2012, actually, at a primary school really near here. And I've managed to keep it going. I mean, touch wood, it's been through probably the toughest decade in education in terms of funding cuts. Initially, it was funded by the council here. They heard about that I was doing it voluntarily, and they approached me and said, we want to pay you to roll this out across Camden.
Mm-hmm.
Then it was funded by the secondary schools. Then the cuts kicked in under the previous government, and the school improvement bit of Camden picked up the tab, and now I'm being funded again by the council. So I've managed to keep it ticking over, and we've got our key performance indicators which suggest that we do make a difference, that we are winning people over to the local schools.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's true, and my experience of something like that actually related to the choice that we made for primary, and I think I may have told you this previously. There were the two fantastic local primaries. We had the choice of two, and I was in a cafe one day overhearing parents talking about the school that we ended up sending the kids to, the primary school. Mm. They were raving about it, and so that was the defining kind of moment for me. Like, well, if it's good enough for these parents, it's good enough for me.
Well, I think that's right. I think the people who are experiencing it are the most informed. Yeah. It is very hard to actually know what a school is like, because you as a parent are never going to experience it. So that was really the news element, is bringing people the story, you know, the latest scoop, if you like, on schools. And I think the other thing which I try and tell parents is that schools change really fast now.
Yes, they do. Yeah.
Because of the pressure of Ofsted. We have this crazy punitive accountability system.
Yeah.
And, you know, I knew from my experience with the school that my kids went to that it wasn't brilliant when my first child went there, but I knew that it could change really fast. Became a governor. We headhunted an amazing head who's still there, who has totally turned the school around. And also I knew, and this is something that I say a lot in our events, sadly, because we have such a narrow academic education system at the moment, it favours kids from certain backgrounds, you know, the usual suspects whose parents perhaps went to university. Yeah. So I knew that because of my own background, my kids were going to do fine wherever they went. So I can honestly say I did not have a jot of anxiety about sending my child to a school which at that point was Ofsted requires improvement. Its numbers had fallen by a third, because I had that inner confidence that he was going to be fine. And I think the other thing was my own experience of education. I went to a school that had predominantly secondary modern intake when my brother and I went there. So it felt like a secondary modern school. Yes. It had become a comprehensive. And this must be the experience of lots of people of my age, actually, because obviously there were far more secondary moderns than grammar schools back in the 70s, showing my age. And most of those schools became comps. And the school was very forlorn in its atmosphere. Very little happened. We never really went anywhere. We never did a school play most of the time. So I look back on it and think it could have been so much more lively than it was if everyone actually had supported it in the community, which they didn't. But I did fine. Yeah. And that's what all the data shows.
Yeah, there's so many ways we can take the conversation from here, but I want to cycle back a little bit first to that kind of that period of transition from journalism to Meet the Parents. Yes, it was a journalistic idea, but you were doing something different. And so I imagine there were kind of new skills to learn or a new mindset to embody challenges that were presenting themselves to you personally. Or maybe not.
I don't really feel that was the case, actually, because I think it was such a journalistic idea. So it was basically about finding families, which is a bit like finding interviewees. I knew loads of them anyway, because I'm always talking to parents about schools. You know, I'm probably tell I'm really pretty obsessed about it. Yeah. So I knew all these families anyway, because I was asking them, you know, what's this school like? And they were broadly positive. And actually hosting these events is a bit like hosting a live on TV, which I've done absolutely loads of over the years. So it was actually using the same skills.
Okay. That's interesting. So which you know, so I've made a career transition myself, and I often think that I'm using a lot of the same skills that I had in a different context. And I think there are people out there, hopefully listening or watching, that are thinking, maybe I want to do something else, but it's something very different. How can I possibly make that move? But it just goes to show that, whether you realize it or not, in the course of a career, you bank a lot of skills which are transferable.
I also think you have to follow your passions. That's what I did. And my passion has always been about community and communication. So that's why I ended up in journalism in the first place, because when I was at university, I thought, oh, that'd be something I'm really interested in. And
where does the passion for community and communication come from, do you think?
I think the community bit comes from the fact that I didn't grow up feeling I was part of a community. So my parents chose to kind of try and be self-sufficient up to a point. It was at the time of The Good Life, the TV programme.
Yes, I remember.
And in the 70s there were a lot of books on being self-sufficient, on eating puffballs and, collecting nettles and all that.
Yeah.
And my dad, full disclosure, was a pioneering educationist.
Right.
So he was from this generation who are now dying out, who were very, very excited about the comprehensive revolution, introduction of comprehensive schools. He was actually teaching at a private school, and then when the whole idea of comprehensives came about, he found it really exhilarating. So he moved into that sector, and he became, at a very young age, the head of a purpose-built comprehensive, which he helped design, and he came up with some really very interesting curriculum ideas, which are not very fashionable at the moment. And he then decided to become an academic, and he wrote 10 books in 10 years.
Wow.
And he ended up actually as an academic in America. But I think him talking about education all the time was very, very influential on me as a child. And then going to a school which, frankly, wasn't very progressive and really suffered, I think, because of its reputation in the community. It's the same thing, the parents chit-chatting away.
Yeah.
My parents' friends in this area where I grew up, which wasn't even a village and it wasn't even a hamlet, it was just like a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. They were sending their kids to private schools. I grew up in Devon. They were all going to private schools in Exeter. And I found that really, really made a massive impression on me. And I felt that the community I grew up in could have been much more lively, much stronger if the children of my parents' friends all went to the same school.
Yeah.
And then also within the town where I went to school, Columpton, it's junction 28 on the M5, is how most people will know it.
Okay.
There were very few people in my year from my kind of background, and although I think it's really important to create a school culture where the values kind of transcend class, and I think that's something that comprehensives are really bad at doing, even now, I still think it's nice to have people from all different backgrounds, and for that to be quite sort of, I don't know, it's difficult being a minority, I think, in any environment.
Yeah.
And I guess I felt I was very much a minority. And all of this, I honestly think every day of my school life, I thought, wouldn't it be great if everyone in this town sent their kids to this school? So that's where the community thing comes from. The communication, I think that's just a sort of personality thing. I've always been quite extrovert. I really like talking. My parents are very good communicators. My dad was very charismatic. He was a teacher. My mum was originally a pottery teacher. And so I think I come from quite a verbal family. So I think that's where the communication comes from.
Okay. And now I can't remember how we got on to community and communication, but those are the themes, the values that you wanted to kind of mould your career around.
Well, I didn't really think of it in that way. I just drifted into journalism because I was really interested in it. So I initially trained on a local paper near where I grew up, the Sidmouth Herald, which back in those days was actually in someone's private home. And we had little typewriters, and it was all, put together in what was the sort of one of the upstairs rooms in this house. It was great. I absolutely loved it. It was a brilliant training. So I just did that because I was really interested. And then I wasn't very kind of strategic, I don't think. I just drifted into this idea of Meet the Parents because it was just really, really winding me up that lots of parents at my kids' primary school would go on about the wonderful sense of community at the primary.
Yes.
And then there's this kind of total weird switch in their brains where they become fixated on schools that aren't in the community. And it made me very angry.
Yeah. Is that because the schools that they're thinking about that aren't in the community are private schools, and there's a desire among a lot of parents to, state. I don't know whether it's a perception that state secondary education isn't good enough in this country.
I think it's driven by fear, and that's what Meet the Parents was about, trying to confront that fear. At my kids' primary school, there were a lot of parents who weren't educated in comprehensives. They'd been educated at private schools. It was that kind of primary school. And so they understandably had a fear of the local comprehensive, and I think that unless you step inside one from a very early point in your kids' education, this fear builds up. There is, I think, a media landscape still now, very much so, that is pro-private, generally in the print media, and that's very influential. I think comprehensives have always had a really negative reputation ever since they were introduced in terms of the media. There's that horrible phrase, bog standard comp. And I think it takes a lot of communication to shift that. And really one of the most effective ways of doing it, I think, is just to put in front of these parents people whose kids are quite like them, because I'm not saying that the panels that we have in our Meet the Parents events are totally representative. They're not. It would be very hard to achieve that. But in a way, that's not massively important. I do think it is important to reflect diversity, and particularly also to reflect neurodiversity, and it's hard to achieve that. But broadly speaking, the people we have on our panels are confident kids who are doing fine, and for all the reasons we know about, those tend to be kids from a certain background. But at the end of the day, the people I'm trying to win over, they want to see people like them doing fine in the local school.
It strikes me that wouldn't it be amazing if you could replicate what you're doing in the local area, or somebody could, and have groups like this up and down the country? Is that something that you've explored before?
I would love to do that. I'm hoping I can expand it. I haven't really focused on that in the last few years because my project has depended on funding from schools and councils, and they have been so skint. In fact, I'd say that state schools are probably more skint now than ever. So for me, it's about two things. It's about money and funding. God, I'd love it if somebody who really believed in comprehensive education came forward and said, "Oh, fund this whole project." I would love to roll it out. But the other problem is the system has become incredibly fragmented thanks to academisation. So we don't have this where we live. We don't have any multi-academy trusts, they're called, which is kind of like chains of schools, which don't necessarily have a link to the community. But we're the only area of London that don't have that. And everywhere else, it's very, very complicated now. So in any given area, you'll have all these different multi-academy trusts. So it makes it a lot harder to expand something like this. But I'm not saying I don't want to do it. I absolutely do want to do it. And in fact, the way policy is being kind of discussed at the moment under this new government, it's going to be, I think, much more about schools collaborating within a given area, and that would make it easier for me to expand it. And I'd love to expand, for example, to Brighton, where there are some real similarities with Camden. They are predominantly community schools, the secondaries, and there's this similar issue that we have here of a very substantial percentage of people going private. So that would be great. And there's lots of other areas I've got my eye on. It's just kind of, I guess I'm just waiting for the landscape to change a bit. But I really should expand it, and I want to expand it.
other than the funding, for you personally, what do you need to do to let's use Brighton as an example. If you wanted to go into that community, what do you need to do?
I need money.
Yeah.
You need funding. That's the funding is really ultimately the issue, and you also have to have all schools on board because it has to be representative. So if any one of our events, we have to represent all the local comprehensives closest to that school. So generally speaking, we'll have no more than 5 schools because otherwise the panels at our primary school events become unmanageable.
Yeah.
So you have to have all the schools willing to be part of it, which requires collaboration, which in someone like Camden is really easy because the schools are working together.
Yeah.
But in other areas, you have this fragmentation. So I will expand it. I'm absolutely convinced I will. I'm just kind of waiting for the moment. So it's dependent on schools wanting to work together and funding.
Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about the films you make as well in conjunction with all of this?
So while I was doing Meet the Parents, I then said, again, I drifted into making films again, which I wasn't thinking of doing. I'd made films for 21 years or a bit less than that. And I just sort of thought when I left the BBC, that's the end of my filmmaking days. But actually, I then started to think, do you know what? I looked at some of the kind of marketing films for the local schools and thought, they're not great. So I initially started making those, and then I thought, actually, what I'm really interested in is innovation in education, because in all honesty, I don't think that at the moment the education system works for all kids. And I understand parents choosing to send their kids to private school if, for example, their children have additional needs. They may feel that they're not under the current budgetary constraints that state schools are experiencing, that their child isn't going to get the attention that they feel they need. So I'm really interested in how to change schools so they become more inclusive. And it's not just about funding, it's also about the curriculum, it's about assessment and making the education that kids experience really relevant and interesting, whatever your background.
Yeah, and just before we begin to talk about some of the films and the schools you're working with, something I don't actually understand about the curriculum situation is, so you were talking about schools being innovative.
Yeah.
To what extent are schools tied to the national curriculum?
So academies technically don't have to follow the national curriculum. So when academies were rolled out on a very large scale by Michael Gove, he made a lot of noise about how we want to give these academies these whole freedoms. The reality is academies haven't really seized those freedoms, and there's very little innovation within the academy system, and there's also not a lot within what we're now called community schools that are still governed by the local authority. So the reason...
Are they tied to the national curriculum?
Yeah, they are. Yeah, they are. And really the reason why, but all those schools are still very innovation averse, is because Michael Gove introduced so much content into GCSEs and A-levels. So there's so much to get through.
Yeah.
And he got rid of coursework largely and introduced these what he called high stakes, exams. So the schools are now, lumbered with an enormous amount of work to get through, and that has really squeezed out a lot of space in the curriculum for them to sort of try and do something different.
Yeah.
So it actually takes a huge amount of courage to decide to rein in the time you're devoting in the curriculum to all the subjects you've got to cover, and try and do something a bit more bespoke that might be more interesting and relevant to the students and might reflect actually more the local area. Yeah.
So it sounds like the system has become a results-driven system.
Totally.
Yeah. So so you're working from the top down, GCSEs and A-levels. what do we need to do to get the grades?
And higher education, in all honesty, it's all driven by higher education and a hugely competitive university system, which is highly selective, unlike, say, the system in, for example, France or other countries in Europe. So really, it's higher education driving all this. The grades you have to get now to get into somewhere that, when we were at school, would probably be, some C's and D's. It's now A's, A stars. So students are under this enormous pressure, and that all percolates down to A levels, and then GCSEs, in all honesty, are not that important. To get into your sixth form, unless it's one of these hyper-selective ones, you don't actually need to have, all nines and all the rest of it. This was the grading that Michael Gove introduced instead of the old A, B, C and all the rest of it. So I think the schools, they're judged to a large extent still by their GCSE results, but actually when it comes to the students, unless you're going for something like Oxbridge, I don't think it's that important, and that's what I tell my kids.
But I think in my mind now, kind of as a dad raising my own children, sure, academics play a part, I think, in a child's life at school, but there's no, as we're saying, there's no room for education about money. There's no room for education about a kind of emotional intelligence. There's so much, life skills.
There's not there, and not just that. There's theories that there are multiple intelligences. There's cognitive intelligence, and you know more about it than me. But the approach that I really love is head, heart, and hand. So it's the head is the cognitive, the heart is more about emotional intelligence and empathy, and the hand is making things, which has been so excluded from the curriculum. I mean, if I look at what I made, because I went to essentially a secondary modern school, they had amazing woodworking and metalworking areas. And, I loved working in those classrooms. Schools don't have that now. So really, it's kind of the worst of all worlds. It's just this really, really narrow academic grammar school system, which is what inspired Gove, which all kids have to do, irrespective of their particular intelligences or capabilities, is a word that I quite like.
One of the questions I'm thinking about as my kids get older is, to what extent is a university education important these days?
That's a really good question, because the whole rhetoric we've had since the Conservatives got in is that university is the key to a good life, and a lot of schools now pump this out. There's a lot of pressure for kids to go to Russell Group universities. I don't think I've seen any evidence beyond things like becoming a doctor or an engineer or a lawyer. I don't think there's evidence that going to university necessarily does guarantee a good life. In fact, you could easily argue now it saddles you with debt. And that's contributing to young people now feeling very anxious about their futures. So I'm a huge fan of lots of different pathways, vocational, and we've got not enough people who are craftspeople, who are electricians, who are plumbers. It's good money, it's a good prospect. You can run your own business. So I'm not sold by any means on university as the be-all and end-all. And I'm not even convinced I believe in this highly selective university system. I don't really know enough about that, but it seems to me it has a really negative effect on our education system, what we have at the moment.
Can you say more about that?
Yeah, so there's there's a writer called Sonia Soda who writes in The Observer and The Guardian. She's quite often writing about how she's very against this highly selective system where, let's say Manchester, you have to get 2 A stars and an A to read engineering, and the whole kind of Russell Group thing, and then the non-Russell Group universities. And I just think it puts too much pressure on students. I think it's a too narrow a way to assess students. And there is an alternative. Like in the States, actually, they don't have quite the same system as we have here. And there's something they call it a transcript, which is a much broader, if I've got it right, a much broader assessment of somebody. And there's something that in fact, private schools have been developing in the States in the last few years called a mastery transcript, which is digital. And it's like a digital record of a much broader range of your capabilities when you get to 18. So if you think about something like the International Baccalaureate, which some private schools do, it's not just high-stakes exams. There is an exam element, but there's also a huge element of doing an individual project that you're really passionate about. There's doing work in the community. There's all these different things, much more making, that then would be represented in a kind of much broader assessment.
Yeah.
And if you go down that avenue, it's actually quite hard to then divide the wheat from the chaff, because it's much more complex.
Yes.
And it's much more subtle in the way it assesses a given student. So in a sense, once you started to do that, you would kind of automatically level the playing field more, and it would be much harder for universities to have this kind of very narrow academic Uber selection process.
How do we
Make that happen?
Yeah, how do we change the system?
There's a lot of thinking going on around that, and there's people that I know of who are now in senior positions within policy making who have definitely identified higher education as the issue. There's been a lot of talk around trying to basically get rid of GCSEs and A-levels and have a broader qualification at 18. And in fact, even Rishi Sunak considered, apparently in this book I've just been reading, when he was thinking about what to put in the Conservative Party manifesto for the last election in July, he even talked about saying we're going to phase out GCSEs, which I think is really positive because in the end you want consensus.
Yes.
So there is a lot of thinking going on in this area, and there's a curriculum and assessment review at the moment that the government has set up. And I don't know how far they're going to go in terms of saying we want to phase out GCSEs, but I'm hoping they will remove some of the vast amounts of content, and that logically will reduce the number of exams that students have to sit, because at the moment they're spending hours in exams.
It's such a stressful process.
It's
Speaking to a number of parents who have kids of that age, and it's horrendous.
It's child cruelty.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I was talking to someone yesterday. Her daughter sat 36 hours of high stakes exams.
Wow.
My son's had to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the reality. You have 4 weeks of around about 25 exams, whereas when I did O-levels, I'm not going to drop you in this one, I think I did 10 exams.
Yeah.
It was all over in about 10 days, I seem to remember. So it's a test of intellectual stamina.
Yeah.
And lots of kids fail.
Yeah.
And the way the system is now judged, and again, this is something that was introduced by Michael Gove, it's norm referenced. So it's a zero-sum game. So for some kids to succeed, others must fail. So the grade boundaries are moved every year to ensure that about a third of kids fail. They reflect the SATs results of that cohort 5 years previous. And it's a totally negative.
It's so unjust.
It's so unjust. So like when I think I'm right in saying when we did.
Well, for me it was GCSEs.
Oh,
so.
you see, I must take that back. But when I did O-levels, and I think when you did GCSEs, if you got beyond 70%, you got an A. Now, because it's norm referenced, there's this bell curve.
Yes.
And every year, even in this area, it's something like, I think it's on average 64% of kids pass GCSE maths and English. And if they don't, they have to keep retaking it, and it's absolutely soul-destroying. Yeah. And as you and I know, you can't get a job in a supermarket now without GCSE maths and English. So it's really hard, it's really tough, and it writes those kids off, and it's just totally unjust, as you say.
I love these conversations. They're so free flowing. But I'm also remembering that 10 or 15 minutes ago I was asking about your films. I don't want to forget, I don't want to forget about that. So
So now what I do is go all around the country, going into predominantly state schools, but I have been into some private schools to focus on schools that are trying to do things a bit differently and break out of this hideous, narrow, academic, Victorian education model which we have had forced upon us. And I really love it because I'm going and talking to head teachers, members of staff who are being really courageous
Yeah.
and taking risks, because at the moment there's nothing in the system to encourage innovation. Ofsted don't even talk about innovation. So there's no motivation to do it unless you think, do you know what, this system's not really serving our students. So it has to come from that moral drive. So I am doing that mainly for a network called Rethinking School, which is about trying to create a kind of whole national network of schools that want to do things differently. And I guess the thing that I've found also particularly rewarding is I made a documentary a few years ago about a comprehensive in Doncaster called XP. And it's brilliant. And it's one of the few times when I've thought, oh God, I'd really love my kids to go to this school.
Yeah.
But it's a lottery system. It's so popular. It's 11 times oversubscribed. So you have to enter a lottery.
And is the school constrained in the way we talked about before? Is it a state school, so it has to follow the
It's
the
a
national
state school,
curriculum?
but it's a free school. And
Right.
Michael Gove came up with these ideas of free schools, this idea of free schools, which was primarily originally to encourage parents to set up their own school. And some people did that. Toby Young is the most well-known example of somebody who did that with the West London Free School. XP was also set up as a free school the same year as, you might have heard of a school called Michaela, which is often described as one of the sort of strictest school in the country.
Right.
XP has Michaela has a driving vision, and so does XP. They're very different visions. And XP's vision, its motto is above all compassion. And it's about, I think Michaela would argue that they're also compassionate. I've never actually visited the school, so I can't really judge. But anyway, XP is about no setting, no selection, celebrating difference. And that really speaks to me.
What does the first part mean? No setting, did you say?
So in most comprehensives, sadly, there's still setting, which means that kids will be put into perceived ability groups.
I see. Yeah.
And so it's not like streaming, which is really, really fixed. Setting, you can move around, although that varies from school to school. But I think I'm right in saying that only about 17 comprehensives in the country don't set. It's really endemic in the English education system.
So if you're not setting, then the kids of all abilities.
It's mixed ability, yeah.
Are in together.
And all the evidence, generally speaking, suggests that if you have mixed ability teaching, the so-called, I hate the word able, but the so-called more able will do fine anyway. And the kids who might previously have been put in the bottom set, which is a term that I absolutely hate, will do better because they'll be rubbing shoulders with kids who will inspire them to, basically learn more successfully.
Yes.
And I saw that myself with my education in my sixth form. We had to go to a sixth form which was attached to what was originally a grammar school, actually. And I remember my brother had a friend who was going to leave school at 18 and go and work in the local electrical shop in Tiverton. And my brother, who was set on Cambridge, as was I, because my parents had told us they wanted us to go to Cambridge, he persuaded this friend of his to apply as well. And he got in, and he stayed, and he's ran an incredibly successful engineering company in Cambridge. And for me, that's a really great example of peer influence.
Yes.
So if you put kids in sets, you're losing that amazing peer success effect, which is quite well documented. So what I love about XP, I love so many things about it, but they do three key things. First of all, they have this concept of crew. So you know how at school you have to do your kind of registration in the morning, in the afternoon, your form tutor time, which is basically a total waste of time.
Yes.
They have really made that a crucial part of the school week. So you spend 4.5 hours a week on average in those groups, but they split them in half and turn them into a group of 12 kids, and they call it crew. And crew becomes this second family at school, and it's a way of kind of breaking down the differences in background between students, encouraging them to sort of help each other rather than pitting them against each other. and it is the absolute breathing heart of the school. It encourages kindness between kids. The second thing they do is they teach in cross-curricular expeditions, as they call them. So in any given term, there'll be a guiding question. So, for example, what does Doncaster owe to the miners? And all the subjects will be brought together in these cross-curricular expeditions, which are made relevant to the kids.
Yeah.
And thirdly, the school's small, so it's only 50 kids in a year, and I really believe in small schools. And there's lots of ways in which you can break down big schools into small schools, and I think that makes it so much more human. And in fact, I think that's one of the big fears that primary school parents have, is the size of local secondary schools.
Yeah, and I can speak to that fear, because Rosie, my eldest, went from a relatively small school to one around the corner, which is it's a huge amount of people. Thankfully, she's thriving, but I don't know to what extent the school works hard to kind of take that big school and make it a little bit smaller.
You can do that. I mean, for example, the house system, which has obviously been around, for ages, and is basically a kind of private school concept. That's a very obvious way in which you can break a school down into smaller groups by having houses. And in New York City a few years ago, they experimented with small schools, and there are lots of examples internationally of doing it. Some are more successful than others, but I think what's, for me, a positive about the falling role that we're seeing now, particularly in London, is it's actually an opportunity to shrink schools, which I think is good, as long as they're still getting the same amount of funding.
Yes, it all comes back to money.
It all comes back to money, yeah.
Before we began recording, you told me that you were very positive about the outlook for education in this country. Having kind of talked it through with you, that statement kind of surprises me a little bit. So what has you
Yes, I see there is
way?
a bit of a contradiction in what I talk about, because obviously I'm massively pro-state, but I'm also very critical of the Gove vision of education. But I am positive, partly because I am a glass half full kind of person.
Yeah.
But I think what gives me optimism is two things. First of all, the current Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, has started to talk about happiness. I've not heard that from anyone ever. She gave a speech quite recently where she said, it's not all about exam results. Happiness really matters.
Yeah. I presume she's a mum.
She is. She's got kids in state school.
And that's not to say that previous ministers have not been parents as well, but it's the type of thing that a parent would say. We all say, I just want my kids to be happy.
Yeah,
so it's really refreshing to hear that from government.
And I think actually that's what most parents want, at the end of the day. They want them to do well, but they also, of course, want them to be happy. But I think that gives me cause for hope, and I think we're starting to see a realisation that the current system is not working. And the key indicator is how many kids there are now who don't go to school regularly, or who are actually being taken out of school and being homeschooled. This is becoming a pandemic, and although it's blamed on the pandemic, which is clearly a factor, I think it's a perfect storm. It's the pandemic, it's the incredibly narrow and stressful curriculum that doesn't work for anyone, actually.
Yeah. There is an anxiety pandemic at the moment.
Which is social media is also partly fueling. So all these things are coming together. There's poverty, which of course, child poverty, now you've got a third of young people growing up in poverty, which is a lot worse than it was back when I was at school, I think I'm right in saying. So all these things come together, and I think there's a realisation we can't carry on. Even politicians on the right will accept that we have to deal with the fact that lots of kids aren't going to school anymore. So that, I think, is what is driving change. And although I'm not convinced there'll be massive structural change overnight, I think we are going to see, I hope, opportunities for schools to start to introduce small elements of innovation which will gradually shift the culture. We're also going to see a new Ofsted inspection framework. I'm not totally positive about that, but I think, there is actually some work being going on in Camden about that, which I think is really good. I'm not convinced that what Ofsted's going to come up with is going to be that positive, but I think at the end of the day, we will see a more benign system. And then the final thing that's given me hope is we're starting to see parents speak out. So I don't know if you've seen, there's been some coverage recently about a school called Mossbourne Academy, which is quite a famous academy, and quite a few parents have been criticising what they perceive as a very harsh, disciplinarian, authoritarian system. In Camden, we don't have schools like that, which is why I run my project in Camden. And as a parent, I don't think that kind of extreme authoritarianism would work for my kids.
Yeah.
Perhaps it works for other kids. I don't know. You know, I know parents who've sent their kids to schools like that. But this is becoming a very, I think, we don't know for sure because there's no accountability within academisation. I think it's becoming very widespread, and I think parents are starting to say kids are not happy under the system, and I think it's a key feeder of children not wanting to go to school. We don't have evidence for that. We need evidence. So I think all these things are a perfect storm, and I hope we will start to see schools return to being more about their community, more about being relevant, because it's boring at the moment in a lot of the curriculum.
Yes. Yep.
And I hope we're going to see more kindness and compassion within schools, because we need that in society.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. I love that vision for the future of education here and elsewhere. That sounds like I'm wrapping up, but I'm not.
Oh yeah, I thought you were.
No,
I thought I got away with it, not talking about my deeper innermost thoughts.
That's right. Well, the podcast is called The Human Edge for a reason. And so one of the things.
Saving the best for last.
Yeah, one of the questions I do say till the end is, what is your edge? Meaning, what makes you, as a human being, what makes you uncomfortable? What do you have to lean into in order to do what you do or to develop?
I think I'm probably quite afraid of failure, because I think we felt a lot of pressure, my brother and I, to be successful. And I've tried very hard not to impose on my children quite a narrow educational vision that my brother and I experienced. I mean, we were taken, get my grammar right, Gove on my back. We were taken around Cambridge University when we were at primary school, I think.
At primary school?
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, certainly I was at primary school. My brother might have just been at secondary, but we were taken around and it was like, oh, this is nice, isn't it? Well, why don't you think of going here? And it was quite subliminal, and so we didn't have this overt kind of breathing down your neck pressure. Yeah. But there's absolutely no doubt that throughout my secondary education, I had this goal of going to Cambridge. And it meant that I had to work incredibly hard, because I'm not saying my school was highly disruptive, but there was, sometimes a bit of low-level disruption, so you have to end up doing your work all over again after school, and my school was incredibly average, and I think even at A-level I had to work really, really hard, and my brother got to Cambridge and I got to Cambridge, but I think it's come at a cost in that I think both my brother and I mean, God, I shouldn't really speak for him, but I certainly think that there was a feeling that we had to be successful academically. And I think you see that in the pressure that actually some of these academies place on kids. Not all of them, but some of them. I think you see it. I don't know anything really about private schools, but I'm aware that they become more and more pressurised in terms of results, because that's what perhaps the parents feel they're paying for. And I think it comes back to this idea, as you say, about this very narrow idea of education is getting great results and going to university the be all and end all, and I don't think it is. So we need a system where success is defined in a much, much broader way. I've heard, I think Rishi Sunak, he was sort of talking about how, success is, doing more maths and all this kind of stuff. I don't see success in those terms at all. I think you could leave school and, most of my classmates would, I think, from memory, would have left school at 16. You didn't need qualifications then. So I think that's probably my edge.
And has that fear of failure kind of followed you throughout your career?
I think to an extent, but I think I feel that I'm dealing with it much more now. I think for me, I've kind of tried to see much more success in my own life as following my passions. And that's what I'm doing. And I think really education, if you go back to the Latin derivation, educare, I was remembering my Latin from school, it's about bringing out what's in you. It's not about induction, which is what this current system has sadly become. So for me, success, in terms of what teachers do or in one's own way one leads one's life, is to bring out the spark, which we all have in different ways. Yeah. So I suppose I feel that that's what I've been trying to do, really. I think I did it when I was a journalist, but I was ready to leave, and the BBC is a very hierarchical organisation, and I didn't really feel I could do that much more to bring out what I wanted to bring out in myself professionally, I think. So I was very happy to leave when I did, and I'm very happy doing what I do now. I Meet the Parents is a very hard project to run. It's very tricky, but I do really believe in it, and I would love to expand it. And
I'm curious about your experience of yourself now professionally, if I can put it like that, compared to kind of your times at the BBC. Well, I'm sure you loved what you do as well, but are you more fulfilled in a sense today doing what you do than what you did back then?
Yes, I think I am. I didn't really like the hierarchy of the BBC. It's a very antediluvian organisation. I don't know enough about it now because I left 15 years ago, but I can't say I liked the way the BBC operated in terms of its sort of layers and layers of management. And I just did my own thing, really. I think I was very fortunate that I ended up in a kind of little kind of enclave as a culture correspondent on Newsnight. I did that for 10 years and I absolutely loved it. And I managed to sort of carve out a little area where I could just get on with what I wanted to do and again, follow my passions. But it was quite a macho organisation then. I don't know if it's the same now. And a lot of jargon and very top-down. Yeah. I felt the people running it came from very narrow backgrounds. I don't know if that's still the case, but I was always very interested to find out about their educational backgrounds and also what the choices they'd made for their own children. And I think that influences editorial decisions, most definitely. Yes. It influences commissioning decisions. So I do feel happier now. I'm quite an independent-minded person, and I think that also comes from my childhood where, I grew up in the middle of nowhere. Yeah. We had to be incredibly self-sufficient. We didn't really hang out with our peers in the way that my children have been able to, which I think is fantastic, and actually for me is probably one of the central reasons, I think, for staying local. And I say this to people in our events, and certainly my boys, when I asked them, what was the best thing about their education, they said having mates locally. Yeah. So
it's something I had growing up as well.
I really wish I'd had that. It must have been brilliant.
It was.
I think that you can't put a price on that. No. You can't measure it because that's when you mature as a person, isn't it? When you're hanging out with your mates after school and you're really stretching yourself socially, emotionally. And I think if you don't have that, and my brother and I didn't really have that much because we literally lived in the middle of nowhere. My closest friend was 5 miles away and I had to cycle to see her. Yeah. It's a huge, huge loss, I think, in childhood.
Thinking about success, maybe this will be the last question. If you think about the measure of success for yourself in the next, let's say, 3-5 years, can you put that into words?
Well, I do quite a lot of campaigning, and I'm part of a think tank called Private Education Policy Forum, which looks at the effect of private education on society. I absolutely love being part of this. It's called PEPF, it's very hard to say. And I help commission research along with a really great professor, Professor Francis Green, who's written a book called Engines of Privilege. And I really, really hope we can start to make some inroads in the next 5 years in thinking about how we can perhaps integrate private schools within the state system, various things that can level the playing field. I feel very strongly that private schools have a very, very negative effect on equality of opportunity. I'm not against private schools per se, but I like the Finnish model where in Finland you can have a private school but you can't charge for it and you can't select academically. That would be fine. And the other thing I'm part of is a new campaign called Time's Up for the Test to phase out the remaining grammar schools. I vehemently disapprove of selection, academic selection. It writes people off, it makes them feel like failures. And of course I lived it in my own experience of my secondary school. And I would love to see politically somebody grasp the nettle and phase out the remaining grammar schools, which they could do with a stroke of a pen, because they have a terrible effect on the comprehensives around them. And I think people don't realise that. But even now, we have 163 grammar schools. It affects 1 in 5 students in terms of taking off, out of the comprehensive intake, those students that we really need in terms of the influence they have on the attainment and the ambitions of other students.
Plenty to look forward to.
Yeah, I'm excited.
I'm excited too. Thank you so much for coming in today.
My pleasure.
It's been a real blast.
Oh, thank you. I've loved it.